All right, I would like to welcome Peter, Amy, Toby, and Lindsay to join us. We'll be talking about psychedelics for leadership development. I see a handful of familiar faces in the crowd, so it's great to see you all. And we're really going to be exploring, it's so often what's talked about in the psychedelic space is the medical and therapeutic use of psychedelics, and what's I think increasingly true is more and more leaders, creators, and builders are looking at how they can work with psychedelics. So we hear the stories of Steve Jobs and Aaron Rodgers and Elon Musk. And on the panel today, we have two incredible executive coaches who have worked with leaders who have really built or are building the future of tomorrow. We have a neurofeedback therapist who works with the brain, and then we have Lindsay, who does some really interesting free diving. And Lindsay, I want to start with you because I think your company that you started last year, Ocean Oriented, is super interesting. Tell us a little bit about your background and specifically what you do with leaders when it comes to free diving. We'll start there.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Dr. Lindsay Bira. I'm a clinical health psychologist by training, and I do have a private practice, and I do speaking. Last year, what I pulled together was I launched a company called Ocean Oriented. And Ocean Oriented is about the neuroscience of resiliency folded into ocean adventure. So I lead this at sea with high-performing people, and what I do is I'm also a free dive instructor. So over the past few years, I got into free diving, which is breath hold diving. So that's taking one breath of air, holding your breath, and then going under and experiencing the physics of the ocean and how it acts upon our biology. Now, free diving is 90% mental, and I noticed this very quickly. And in fact, it overlaps with some evidence-based treatment tools that we use to treat anxiety and panic. One of these is the breath hold to 60 seconds. And what's very powerful about holding your breath is it's an immediate test to see what your relationship is with your brainstem and your limbic system. So as these alarm bells go off, you get the choice about how much meaning you put to them. And this directly relates to high performance. So when something happens in our life, a stressor, what happens is our limbic system goes off and sends alarm bells. But we get to choose how much meaning we give those alarm bells. Free diving is like a little petri dish or a rapid test to see what your relationship to that is and to work in real time with the bench press of appraisal, which is a frontal lobe skill, to work on your relationship with your own brain. And so that's what I founded with Ocean Oriented, was I take people out and we work on high performance and resiliency in the ocean through freediving, spearfishing, and basic neuroscience of resiliency, where we use a measure to measure that and track it over time. So that's what I launched last year, and it's been a great creative project and very rewarding.
This is a great opening because we talk about psychedelics, the actual, let's say, drugs or medicine, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, but there are so many other modalities or tools that facilitate these non-dual experiences or altered states of consciousness. And Toby, something that you've been working with is neurofeedback. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what are some of the fundamentals of neurofeedback, and how does it help to train the brain into a state of, let's say, high performance or awareness?
Yes, absolutely. So neurofeedback is basically a way to modulate and train the electrical activity of your brain. So to just back up, our brain functions both on a chemical as well as electrical level. So a lot more people talk about the neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, but we can also actually much more easily measure the levels of electricity going on in the brain with a technology called an EEG. So neurofeedback, or EEG neurofeedback, is a way to actually measure and then have feedback on your own brainwave activity. So it's kind of like holding a mirror up to your brain so you can actually get into desired states and get out of unhealthy patterns. So neurofeedback's been around since the 1970s and well studied. Over 1,200 empirical studies on conditions ranging from anxiety to depression, a lot of ADHD, traumatic brain injury, and then also a lot of peak performers, pro athletes. Tom Brady has talked about utilizing neurofeedback, different Olympians, I know Tony Robbins talked about a neurofeedback retreat that he did. So I think it's definitely moving a lot more into the leadership space, because neurofeedback is a really data-driven approach. When it comes to something like meditation, it's great, but it's relying on your subjective experience. Like, am I doing this right? Sometimes you feel like you're in a deeper meditative state, sometimes you're not. What I think is really cool about neurofeedback is a way to actually track your progress with data. With an initial brain scan, you can know exactly which areas of the brain need to be trained, in which directions, whether you're trying to increase or decrease levels of a specific brainwave, and then you can actually do follow-up brain scans to track and measure to see if your brain is changing in that desired direction.
Thank you. That was very thorough, Toby. And Amy, I would love for you to build on that. So you're a doctor of Chinese medicine, and for the last couple of years now, you've been doing neurofeedback intensives with high performers, with leaders and CEOs and executives. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what are you noticing in terms of the before and after of neurofeedback, and how might that be similar to and different to psychedelic work?
Sure. So in the last few years, my colleague, Dr. Drew Pearson, and I have taken into an intensive format, working, as Paul said, with really already peak performing leaders, pioneers, and visionaries. And from a Thursday to a Monday, we can often get a 40% change in their neurological function at the targets that they are wanting to get after. So Toby, that was a beautiful description. Neurofeedback therapy and understanding the brain is actually very complex. And what's amazing is that people can come in truly in one state of being, and as Toby was describing, we can upregulate or downregulate certain functions and attributes to be able to really unleash the true person that's inside. So peel back layers of trauma, change the perspective by working with the default mode network of how the person perceives themselves, the level of threat detection that they experience in their outer reality. We can often work with that, not just via the amygdala, who gets maybe a lot of attention, but also by training directly into the brainstem, the cerebellum, which is where a lot of the information comes from that goes to the amygdala. So it's a very, very highly specific way of training or achieving results. And it is incredible for being able to tailor and really pull back the layers of the onion, or those things which are not self, to be able to then find the self. So a lot of the times people experience that as mystical experiences. It can be experienced as a lightening or a liberation. It does feel, when you do it in an intensive format, like a little bit of a journey. It's just, in this case, we kind of spread things out, and it's exactly tailored to that individual. So everything that we're doing is exactly for that individual, with exactly what we see in their brain signature. There are things like early childhood traumas that specifically are mother wounds that can be identified in the brain signature on an electrical level. So we know exactly what's going on with that person, and what's amazing is that rather than having to just talk through all of that, we can go in and change that way that that person is feeling, and help to alleviate that early childhood trauma in that case on an electrical level in their brain. So it's extremely precise. Now, if we shift over to the work with psychedelics, psychedelics do a global opening. I obviously love both tools. We work with both tools in our work. But with psychedelics, what we're doing is really engaging with the medicine to help to guide us to new places. And it is, we can have an intention, and sometimes then the medicine takes us somewhere else, right? And that can happen. But what is true is that ultimately with psychedelics, that you're not necessarily able to break through that which at a deep level you're a no to break through. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it can still happen. But not always can we access what is just beyond that veil of illusion, or what is just beyond that construct that that person's consciousness can hold. It's not always available, because at some level we still have that autonomy to be a no. And so working with psychedelics it is brilliant, and it can create a lot of relief and a lot of change very quickly, but it doesn't necessarily have the specificity of neurofeedback therapy.
And that's why, we love to look at modalities, how they work synergistically or integratively or in combination and partnership with one another. And one of the polarities that I love to explore is ancient wisdom meets cutting edge technology. So neurofeedback really is a cutting edge technology. Psychedelics you could consider to be either or. We could consider them to be ancient because we've used them for thousands of years, or you could consider them, things like MDMA, ketamine, 2CB to be more cutting edge because they're basically analogs of these ancient medicines. Now, meditation is one of those ancient technologies. And Peter, you have you've studied a lot of Buddhism. A lot of your practice is rooted in Buddhist wisdom, Buddhist traditions, and you found a way to weave that into your executive coaching. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, we're hearing about all of these sort of cutting edge ways. What is it that Buddhism has to teach us about leadership, and how can psychedelics help us to embody our Buddha nature as leaders?
Is this on? Yeah. Well, I'm a psychologist and a psychoanalyst, and psychoanalysis is not particularly in fashion these days, but I like to describe it as a technology of an altered state. So in psychoanalysis, people will come 4 or 5 days a week, they lie down on the couch, and you drop in as deeply as you can into the patterns of relationship and development that got them to the present. Now, when I began pivoting into executive leadership, the people I'm working with now don't have the time or the bandwidth to come in that many days a week and lie down on the couch. And so the question is, how do you drop in deeper so that you're not just veneering change over the surface? And one of the things that I really like is bringing together psychoanalytic coaching with psychedelic work, because the psychedelics allows a deepening of the work in a much more rapid and immediate way. I also am very interested in Buddhist perspectives. I like to think a lot about infinity in the Lotus Sutra as a way of, in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha invites the following to really imagine infinity and to see how very big it is. And I like to say that infinity is so big that anything you can imagine is happening somewhere in infinity. We have in infinity, every version of this panel is happening. In one version of this panel, everybody in the room has a spontaneous full awakening and becomes the Buddha. I'm hoping it's this infinity. It would be amazing. I also like to think a lot about, how do you bring more compassion into leadership? It's a very arduous path to be a young founder, and much pressure is on your shoulder, and it can seem often that there is not room, that it is not powerful enough to be compassionate. And I think that one of the things psychedelics can really show people is that compassion is a form of power and decisiveness. So I like to talk about the story of Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion. And the story is that once in space and time, he, or in his feminine aspect, her feminine aspect, Kuan Yin, vowed to save all sentient beings. And when he began trying to think of all the sentient beings that needed saving, coming back to infinity, it was so overwhelmingly large that his head shattered. The Buddha then gives him 11 heads. So if you see a statue, you'll see these stacked heads. And now Avalokiteshvara can think the thought of all the beings that need help. And so he then begins trying to reach out to help. But there are, again, so many that his arms shatter. And so the Buddha gives him 1,000 arms, and in the palm of each hand is an eye. So Avalokiteshvara, seeing what is needed, reaches out with help. It is very immediate. And in a way, I like to think of that image of the 1,000 arms with the seeing hand as a template for what an effective leader can do. I used to think that Avalokiteshvara had enlightenment and then made this vow. But what I increasingly see, it is that it is only by making this vow of compassion that our head is shattered, that the local, egoic, narcissistic self breaks up, and then we begin to be able to think empathically. But the 11 heads, one way to think of it is that we come together as a Sangha, as a community of thought and dialogue and feeling.
Thank you, Peter. That was well said. So we talk about leadership development, and Amy, I want to kind of come back to you as we make our way back. So much of leadership is more about, as Peter was emphasizing, devotion, being in service, and I would even say stewardship. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what do you notice with the leaders that you work with, how their consciousness changes, how their values change, to be more about service rather than what I can take for me, my I.
Yeah. I think that so many of the people that are in the greater community that we serve are actually fundamentally really good people, but they'll get really confused with their ambitions and their mission and kind of run over people in the process. Potentially their own team, potentially they are sort of understanding who it is that they're serving, but not actually able to step into the shoes. Or they're getting there by a means of we win, and which kind of means others lose in that paradigm. It's a little bit in that duality. So what we're seeing, whether it's through the work with psychedelics or what the work through neurofeedback therapy is, or in some places when legal and where legal, both at the same time, is we're seeing that people are able to soften and become more broad in their perspective. And I think that this is, it's really massive. A lot of people will complain about how the world is structured around them, but not be willing to make the change that is required internally to be a part of that change. So they'll be on a really high and mighty mission, but they'll show up at work a complete asshole, if I can just be blunt, right? Or a bit of an asshole or a jerk or whatever out in the world or with their families or in these other places. And it's so important that we not just serve others and be a part of the positive change for the world, but actually be that inside of ourselves, energetically or in a vibe level and what we're putting out in the world. We need to make sure that we're not just sort of net neutral at the end of the day, but actually net positive. And the best way that we can really serve is to augment our consciousness, which is probably why we're all in this room, is that we understand that via the work with psychedelics, we can really grow in ways that are exponential to just thinking with our mind, I should be a good person, or I would like to do great things. So being able to really work with that at a fundamental level, and as Peter was referencing, making that pledge out in advance is the biggest thing that I see. So if we were going to talk about success ratings and what it is that we look for the people that come through our programs, I'm looking for people who are a full hell yes for change internally as much as they are for the change externally. If they're more excited about being like conquering basically and creating whatever so that their Instagram looks awesome, I am completely uninterested. Because if they're not willing to make change internally, they will not get the results. And that is true whether we're talking about with psychedelic medicine or whether we're talking about with neurofeedback, or really in the way that I would see it, and to go back to what Peter was speaking to, with any modality or any point of view. Are we a yes for that change? And through that humility and knowing that we have to basically confront and be with all of the shadow, all of those limiting thoughts, we understand that we are basically in our organizations or with the teams and the people that we influence. If we're in a leadership role, what that means is that we are the holographic representation. What we see in our organizations is a demonstration of the self. So this is why when I've been doing executive coaching for the last decade, I require that I work with the CEO, not just other leaders on the team. Because essentially, the CEO is the place to make the change for the entire organization. And anything that exists inside of that CEO that is not refined and aligned will demonstrate itself in the teams, in the systems, and in the functions, and essentially in the viability for that organization to thrive and be resilient.
Thank you. Another round of applause. Toby, I'm going to skip you. I'm going to go to Lindsay, and then I'm going to come back to you. Lindsay, you talk about resilience a lot, right? And if has anyone here done free diving? Okay, a few. Has anyone watched that documentary on Netflix about free diving? That was really, really fantastic. So we talk about resilience when it comes to leadership. Tell us why you think resilience is so important for leadership. And even beyond that, how do we take leaders from being resilient to actually really flourishing and not just sort of keeping out the chaos, but actually growing and evolving from chaos?
Yeah, great question. So I view resilience as a buffer zone for what we're going to face in life. And the reason why I got into resilience for high-performing people is because I spent 8 years as a contract psychologist for the US military, where I was treating the endpoint of disease and disorder. So I was seeing full-blown PTSD after PTSD had been very alive for a long time, crashing multiple domains of somebody's life. And I started asking the question, why are we treating the endpoint of disease and disorder? I was also in the cardiovascular unit as a health psychologist, a behavioral medicine specialist, where we were getting referrals for people who have had one cardiac event, so that's a heart attack or a stroke, and they got assigned to my group, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness training, stress management, because we know if somebody gets that training, you greatly reduce the risk of a second heart attack. But I'm sitting in that group, leading that group, saying, why are we waiting until the first? You know, like this seems a little bit futile of an effort. And so I started to really think on this and developed a speaking series on resilience where I would get hired by companies, because some of these veterans and military, they were actually very high performing people, but they had been in such a stressful environment that they had had one cardiac event and they got referred to my group, or they were, exposed to so much trauma and a lot of responsibility trauma, losing people that they cared about, that then they had full-blown PTSD despite all their compensatory mechanisms of high IQ, social skills, etc., right? There's not much that we can do with the end point, and that's exhausting. So this is when I started to really focus on resiliency and say, we as a population, especially for people who have higher levels of responsibility, we need these tools and skills to understand how the brain works so we can be smarter than our brain and build up the skills, build up the frontal lobe connections, have more control over the limbic system so that when we're trotting along in life and then on a idle Tuesday, a big trauma happens, we actually have the grit and buffer zone to handle that in better ways. So I view that as the real power around mental health and why this is so exciting that we've normalized working on yourself and that we all can say that we have more work to do. This is also why psychedelics to me are so exciting. I have some very healthy trepidation with it because it's still very underground and we're also seeing some issues with that on the clinical side. But we do need some experiences and substances that help us reset and really take off all these layers of avoidance and things that we put in place that prevent us from working on ourselves and from really growing. And so kind of back to ocean oriented, like you said, when we're underneath the water doing free diving, that it is like a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And you are activating your mammalian dive reflex, which comes with a cascade of neurobiological responses and physiological responses that actually mimic a very meditative state of oneness completely under the water. And you're doing things that you didn't even know that your body was capable of, but we all have that innate ability. So I think, what is so important and what I've developed through Ocean Oriented and what I really speak about and stand for is doing things that get us outside of our comfort zone so that our brain is functioning differently and incorporating sometimes substances that really allow us to turn off the default mode network and look at things completely differently, because that's where we unlock pieces of ourselves, we unlock creativity, we understand how to work with our brain, and then we're relating to the world differently and maintaining those levels of resiliency. Thank you.
Love it. We have about 5 minutes left. Toby, if we could spend about 2 minutes. Yesterday you shared a preprint with me, which was really interesting, about this overlap between psychedelics and neurofeedback. Spend about 2 minutes explaining that study and what people found, the researchers found when combining psychedelics with neurofeedback.
Right. So this is something that's kind of anecdotally been done by neurofeedback practitioners for a little while. As far as, it makes sense as kind of, I think of it as like a pre-workout, right? Where, with psilocybin, taking a microdose is going to facilitate that neuroplastic state. Neurofeedback is really harnessing the brain's ability to rewire itself on an electrical level. So, theoretically, it had made sense for a while to actually utilize, microdosing or even higher amounts of, say, ketamine journeys and combine that with neurofeedback in a variety of ways. So I actually used to work at an addiction center, a rehab clinic, in which we would do a different technology called neurostimulation. We would do that a few hours prior to patients who would go through the ketamine journeys. And the reason being, kind of opening up that neuroplastic window, which anecdotally people reported actually a lot more powerful experiences after they kind of had their brains primed. So it was really cool to see this study that came out last year actually looking at, does microdosing psilocybin assisted neurofeedback, can that actually work, on a research level? And the results were actually really promising. They showed that it did enhance people's ability to make those brainwave changes that neurofeedback is requiring, but kind of in a more intense, dramatic way, because neurofeedback is a process that can take a little bit of time to work. Usually within 3 to 5 sessions, people will start noticing feeling more relaxed or better focus. But when you can amplify that with another technology, whether that's microdosing, whether that's infrared light therapy or audiovisual entrainment, these other neurotechnologies that I work with, I think all of these things I view as like tools in our psychological tool belt. Neurofeedback I don't view as the be-all, end-all. Microdosing, I think all of these things, in addition to the basics of nutrition, nootropics, exercise. Well, I guess nootropics not a basic, but something I like to expand on. But I view all of these things as tools in our tool belt for optimal brain health and brain performance. So I think when we can figure out how to synergize and combine these things in a cool way, it can really amplify people's results.
Thank you, Toby. We'll end with you, Peter. So I'm just going to ask you straight up, why do you believe that psychedelics are such phenomenal tools for developing the leaders of tomorrow?
Well, I'm going to tell a story then. There's a young man who I've worked with now for a couple years. He just graduated from a top business school. He'd been in finance ahead of time, and he's back in the finance world. And at graduate school, he was so gifted, one of the professors said, "We'd like to give you $100 million to buy a company and run it." He comes from a gorgeous Muslim family, and his father is a generous, beautiful leader of the community. And this man's aspiration has been to live up to his dad. And the plan was, I'm going to make $1 billion, and then I'm going to follow in my dad's footsteps. But it was all a bit veneered or on the outside to him. And we'd been talking for a while about psychedelics, and he went to Holland, and he's done 2 psilocybin journeys. And in the first one, this guy has almost no trauma, so it was all bright and beautiful. And his first great insight was that God, the everything that is, wants creation. That is what is godly. And he saw that his task is to create. In the second one, he actually ended up going underground. And he was like, this is not as beautiful as the last one. And he went down, and his brother helps with the burial of the dead in his community. And there's a process of wrapping the dead in a shroud, in a white shroud. And then he saw his dad buried in the shroud, which, is a heartbreaking grief to him because his dad is so gorgeous. And what he then saw is that the shroud was actually the reflection of all of his dad's deeds. And it was beautiful because his dad has been so gorgeous. And so what I like to see is that this man, rather than inheriting a spirituality, is beginning to occupy it from the radiant center, from the inside out. And my hope and my belief is that as he becomes a leader of the company that is on the horizon, he will wrap himself. The company will be part of the white shroud of, I hope, compassionate beauty.
I know we're over time. Just give me 30 seconds to wrap. So I think the hope is that psychedelics help to usher in this new sense of where spirituality meets business, and that we can find a way to find the sacred once again in what's been an overly commodified and materialist world. And that instead of having values that are rooted in superficiality, we refine these values that are rooted in reality, that are rooted in nature, that are rooted in relationship, that are rooted in community. And so my hope is that we continue to wake up to the truth of who we are, to the truth of who we're becoming, and that in that process we recognize this way that we live in interbeing and interconnectedness with everything around us. So let's give it up for our panelists who did a phenomenal job. We didn't talk about microdosing at all, but tonight we have a party for the Microdosing Collective, which you all are invited to. Microdosingcollective.org/Wonderland 2023. You can get your tickets there. And finally, we also have a training program that both Peter and Amy are faculty in for executive coaches, health and wellness coaches, life and relationship coaches, and clinicians to work and master the skill of psychedelics. So if you're a coach or facilitator who is interested in this overlap, please reach out to me. Thank you.